Some people say that Sri Lanka is the place where Adam and Eve took refuge after they were evicted from the Garden of Eden. They're supposed to have crossed what is known as Adam's Bridge from India. The Adam's Bridge is a string of coral reefs and sandbanks connecting Sri Lanka with the mainland of India. Others maintain that Sri Lanka itself was paradise, and this may be true, for Sri Lanka is an island paradise.
Want Sri Lanka is een paradijselijk eiland.
Sri Lanka, a word from Sanskrit, means the splendid island. But in 1602, it was still called Ceylon. Dutch ships had so far only sailed past it and caught rumors about spices, riches, and Portuguese dominance. Of course, they couldn't resist such a temptation. They went there. The first preparations for a voyage to distant Ceylon were made in Veere, in Zeeland.
Naar het verre Ceylon werden getroffen in Veere, in Zeeland.
Veere, then, was a dynamic port, where even a Scottish trading house had been set up amongst the great private entrepreneurs who ransacked the seas in search of merchandise and lucrative trade. One of the most formidable competitors amongst the big bosses in the northern provinces was the trading house of the enterprising Fleming Balthazar de Moucheron, who had sunk a lot of money and energy in many an impressive expedition, and who adorned his city with many a looted trophy. Moucheron's nose for business was soon aroused by the promising scent of cinnamon, and he promptly equipped 3 ships, the Sheep, the Ram, and the Lamb. In May 1601, they were sent to sea. For more than a year, these ships roamed the oceans, first to the usual port of call, Annobon, to take in refreshments, and then on southwards. As admiral of the expedition, de Moucheron had appointed the famous Joris van Spilbergen, a dyed-in-the-wool sailor who already had quite a few wild and daring feats to his credit, such as trips to West Africa and Guinea, and a successful foray to Brazil. 10 years later, he was to be one of the first to sail around the entire world. Just beyond Africa, the expedition hit a cracking gale, and the 3 ships totally lost sight of each other. One of them, however, managed to stay on the right course, and touched first at Cochin in India, and then sailed on to Ceylon. This was the Sheep, the flagship, under command of von Spilbergen himself. The two others didn't put in until 1 month later. Unfortunately, the Sheep sighted land on a rather unclear stretch of coastline. But some friendly natives who happened to be fishing there didn't mind exchanging a few knives for a bit of useful information, and they told von Spilbergen where he could land safely. They also told him that the Kingdom of Kandy had been in constant rebellion against the Portuguese occupation. The admiral didn't waste a minute, but immediately set off to meet the king, who sounded worthy of befriending. It was a hard journey of 200 kilometers inland, through plains, marshes, hills, jungle, and hidden villages. Von Spilbergen, of course, could not possibly have known that meanwhile, in his far-off homeland, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, had been founded, which rather put his private enterprise in the air. In fact, it now came under the authority of the 17 gentlemen. Nor could the admiral have guessed any of the mysteries that lay ahead of him when, after 28 days, he finally reached the mountains of the Kingdom of Kandy. To his great relief, von Spilbergen was instantly received with pomp and circumstance by the King of Kandy, who begged him for support against the Portuguese. He even offered to help build a Dutch fortress with his own hands and all available labor, including his wife. Joris rather liked the idea and promised the king all possible help. The admiral and the king struck up a friendship with each other and talked for days on end about business, geography, the art of war, yes, even about philosophy and politics. When the king showed him the fantastic Temple of the Tooth, von Spilbergen was also introduced to the Eastern religion. Buddhism had already been imported to Ceylon 2 centuries before Christ, but had been mercilessly suppressed by an Indian conqueror after only 1 century. Many temples were then destroyed to the last stone, and the foundations of some were not exposed again until the 19th century. Later, Buddhism, together with Hinduism and Islam, recovered itself to become one of the main religions in Ceylon. The king, too, with his very intriguing mind, gathered a lot of knowledge, even a bit of Dutch, so that he could say in Dutch, with great pride and the most peculiar accent, "Kandy has now become Dutch." Truly Dutch, let alone Protestant, Ceylon could of course never be, if only because since time immemorial, worship had been rooted in the old Eastern religions. But in 1505, 1 century before the Dutch, the arrival of the Portuguese had been reported thus: handsome men with iron vests on and hats, who eat white pieces of rock, and who drink red blood. The Portuguese brought Christianity, and in no time turned many thousands of Sinhalese into Roman Catholics. The VOC had hardly been founded when in 1602 it swiftly sent its own expedition to Ceylon under the command of Vice Admiral Sebald de Weert, a man who previously, during the disaster trip to Japan, had sneaked home with his tail between his legs, and on the way, just to get some mention in the history books, had discovered the Falkland Islands and named them the Sebald Islands. Hardly 3 months after von Spilbergen had been waved goodbye, Sebald de Weert arrived on the coast of Ceylon. Sebald, too, was impetuously welcomed and received in state, and half the population turned out to help him and to please him in every way. Friendly natives helped him carry his things ashore and promptly directed him to the king in the depths of the country. The king, of course, thought that Sebald had been sent to help him against the Portuguese, and apparently embraced him so tightly that his bones creaked. Sebald de Weert knew nothing, but understood where his chances lay. The king personally traveled with him to the coast, and on the beach of Santa Marutu, Sebald improvised an instant plan for the conquest of the town of Gol. But some days later, it was Sebald himself who messed up all good prospects. Out of sheer enthusiasm, the king had organized a gigantic beach party, during which he made lots of attractive womenfolk bring costly gifts for his new ally. Sebald de Weert threw in for his part 1 barrel of wine after another from the ship, and got the king, but mainly himself, thoroughly plastered. It may have been just possible to ignore his pestering of the ladies in waiting and his uncouth language, but when the king, after a few days, announced his wishes to return to his dear wife in Kandy, de Weert must have said something like, "Oh, my dear chap, don't be such a bore. There are plenty of men at the palace to please Her Majesty, aren't there?" The king considered this such an impertinent insult that he flew into a rage and had Sebald de Weert executed on the spot. A few miles north of Amsterdam, surrounded by polders, is the picturesque village of Akersloot. Akersloot has not always been amongst the fields. Indeed, the harbor used to be tidal, as it was directly connected to the sea. Many a peasant boy or local fisherman's son from Akersloot has risen to become a deep-water seaman, and so it was with a boy by the name of Willem Jacobson Koster. The murder of Sebald de Weert had thoroughly dampened Dutch interest in Ceylon, and the VOC meanwhile had decided to set up its Asian headquarters in Indonesia rather than on Ceylon. Meanwhile, the Dutch had obtained a firm footing in India as well, and there they received one appeal after another from the King of Kandy to forget the unfortunate matter with Sebald de Weert and to help him with ships and cannons in his struggle against the Portuguese occupiers. But it was another 30 years before the Dutch turned their attention to Ceylon again. This time they sent Jacobson Koster with the instruction to conquer the cinnamon island for the company. On the 18th of May, 1638, Willem Jacobsen Koster caught sight of Ceylon, and as soon as his telescope spotted Fort Batticaloa, he gave the order to hoist the blood flag as a signal to go into the attack. Within 4 hours, Koster managed to bombard the Portuguese to jelly and secure the fortress, while the king, despite all his wonderful promises, kept himself and his army at a safe distance and looked on. Immediately after his conquest, Koster wrote a letter to Batavia in which he spoke very highly of the spirit of courage and determination of his sailors and soldiers. He was rather less contented with the so-called support from the king, who only showed up when the fortress had been safely secured, and who subsequently ordered 700 Sinhalese, who had fought on the side of the Portuguese, to be pulverized by a herd of elephants as punishment. Immediately after the conquest, Koster rebuilt and strengthened Fort Batticaloa. It became the first Dutch stronghold on Ceylon, and at the same time, the start of 150 years of Dutch rule and colonization. Today, the fortress is still being used for various purposes, and whenever building work is carried out, interesting odds and ends come to light.
cm.
2 feet below ground level is a layer dating from the time when the Dutch were here. We can identify it by the chips and bits of roof tiles sticking out, and also by the fragments of a plate which we found earlier. Further south, we find the small town of Trincomalee, where the Portuguese had built a fortress to defend the beautiful natural harbor. Koster immediately pounced on it and managed to secure it after a short but violent struggle, while the support promised by the king again consisted of no more than looking on at a safe distance. The Dutch strengthened this fort as well, with solid bastions called Zeeburg, Amsterdam, Enkhuizen, and the Cat. Later, within the compounds of the fortress, Fort Frederick, a great Hindu temple was built on the same spot as a much older one, which had earlier been demolished by the Portuguese, who wanted the stones for their fortress. Right beside this temple is Swami Rock, in Ceylon, generally known as Lover's Leap. For in 1667, a broken-hearted Dutch girl threw herself from this rock 45 feet down into the sea because her lover had sailed off to Batavia. Why did the Dutch want Ceylon so badly? And why did the Portuguese offer such a stubborn defense? It was mainly for the cinnamon, which today is still gathered in the same way as it used to be, from the branches of the cinnamon tree. First, the tree is stripped of its outer bark, after which the inner bark is carefully removed with a knife and dried in small heaps. 'T. In those days, only cinnamon and hardly anything else was cropped on Ceylon. And so the Dutch immediately took action to introduce a more varied agricultural policy, by growing more rice, for instance, for which there was a high demand. The danger of a one-sided cultivation has always been a threat to Ceylon. First it was nothing but cinnamon, then it was nothing but coffee, until a coffee disease broke out, which all but bankrupted the country. And the British, in their turn, turned Ceylon into one gigantic tea garden. Only recently has Sri Lanka taken steps to restrict the dangerous mono-cultivation of the famous Ceylon tea and pay more attention to other produce. But in the 17th century, everything revolved around cinnamon, and the Dutch took a thorough and uncompromising line on this matter. They started off by doubling the price on the European market, from 3 to 6 guilders per pound. This instantly yielded high profits to the VOC, but never enough, of course. Therefore, the cultivation of cinnamon was taken firmly in hand and reorganized in the so-called cinnamon gardens. But first of all, the Portuguese had yet to be expelled from a number of other cities, starting with Gaul. Coster didn't like to waste time. He went for it immediately. When Willem Jacobsen Coster arrived here with 13 ships, it was at once clear to him that it was impossible to attack the fort from this end because of all the reefs lying around the peninsula. So he landed on the other side with his 2,000 soldiers and started the attack on Fort Gaul. Again, the blood flag was hoisted, and the smart admiral joined battle, which this time proceeded with a lot more bloodshed and difficulty. On the Dutch side alone, it cost 100 dead and 400 wounded. The main reason for this was the fact that, once again, despite all his wonderful promises, the king just looked on at a safe distance and didn't come nearer until the battle had been decided. To Coster's great annoyance, the king nevertheless tried to claim credit for the victory himself, and further inland, he even had a great monument to his heroism erected, to hammer home the point for prosperity. The Dutch, who had actually settled the matter, were only mentioned as his allies. The king looked upon the Dutch merely as his personal servants, and never bothered to stick to any agreements. When Coster later marched to Kandy in a fit of temper to get the king to give chapter and verse, the king tried to get rid of him by unleashing a giant snake. Coster managed to master the snake, but he couldn't match the king's hired assassins who ambushed and killed him. Gaul is still a piece of Holland in the tropics, with front doorsteps, storage houses, and streets that are the epitome of Asian disorder, but nevertheless carry typically Dutch names. The Lijnbaanstraat, for instance, meaning rope walk, was of course the location for the roperies. Rope making remains an important home industry in Sri Lanka. It is often carried out in the backyards behind the houses, using reels and spools and other largely handmade appliances. Gol was also the spot where 100 years later, the notorious Dutch governor Peter Faust made his appearance. He strode in, took one look at the fortress, glanced over the country and declared at once, "I could rule this country with one eye." He started off by having extra slaves brought in to convert the fortress into an impregnable fortification. As usual, the entrance gate was embellished with the proud emblem of the VOC. As the country didn't, as it turned out, allow itself to be ruled with one eye after all, Peter Faust eventually embarked on a ghastly reign of terror, richly sprinkled with all kinds of inhuman outrages. Eventually, he went completely berserk and had to be whisked off to Batavia, where he was beheaded for his crimes. But to start with, there was nothing wrong with him. He was just very proud of the completion of his fortress, with its indestructible bastions. So a great feast was organized. 3 young women were invited each to fire a cannon. The one who fired the best shot was allowed to choose the names of the 3 new bastions. The winner was a widow, who hardly 1 week later married the governor.
Die een week later in het huwelijk trad met de gouverneur.
And she didn't have to think particularly hard, but named one of the new bastions Akersloot, after the birthplace of Willem Jacobsen Koster, the man who had conquered Gol for the Dutch. In the heart of the old fortification of Gol, as early as 1650, the first Dutch Protestant church was built, but it was destroyed only a century later. In its place, a later governor erected the famous Grand Church in gratitude for the fact that his marriage, which had remained childless for many years, had finally been blessed by the birth of a daughter. The Dutch showed a lot more benevolence and tolerance towards Buddhism than the Portuguese had done, and on many occasions even helped to rebuild and restore temples which had been destroyed by the Portuguese. The splendid murals in the temple of Ceylon illustrate the whole story. The fanatical Portuguese razing the Buddhist temple to the ground. The king asking the Dutch to help him rebuild it, and eventually a Dutch merchant offering to foot the bill for the entire restoration, an investment which undoubtedly yielded the necessary favors in return. The Dutch had learned from experience elsewhere that there was nothing like the palm tree for useful products, so they had thousands and thousands of young palm trees planted along Ceylon's coastline. Virtually every part of this tree can be used. The leaves for roof covering, the timber for building houses. It produces oil, coconut, raffia, sago, cane, sisal, drinking mugs, and even the raw material for a heady alcoholic beverage called arak. In fact, all the southern coasts of Ceylon still owe their romantic appearance to the Dutch. The mightiest stronghold of the Portuguese was Colombo, and it took 7 months of martial perseverance to get them out. In Colombo, too, the Dutch have left their traces, again, for example, in the street names. There is one particular Dutch remnant in Colombo, which the Sri Lankese still avoid like the plague. This is the former dwelling of the notorious Peter Faust. On the day when Peter Faust was beheaded in Batavia, it became haunted so terribly that the new occupants fled from it screaming, and nobody has ever dared set foot in it since. In the 17th century, the Dutch were known all over the world as experts on waterworks, and in Ceylon as well. They lived up to their reputation. Many of the canals dug here by the Dutch for both irrigation and shipping have now gone out of use. But the 95-mile-long canal from Colombo to Puttalam has recently been sheet-piled again with Dutch aid and can now again take shipping. It is, however, constantly threatened by the tidal forces in the beautiful lagoons, which cause the outlet gradually to silt up. But the Sri Lankese, despite their primitive means, do continue to make efforts to keep the canal open. In the bay, which is still called Dutch Bay, the Portuguese never had more than a fortified stockade. When the Dutch conquered it, they converted it, as to be expected, into a redoubtable fortress, Fort Kalpitia, or Kalpentijn. Within the walls, they built a commander's house, a prison, and rows of warehouses for the storage of agricultural produce, of which Kalpentijn became an important transport center. All the walls of the fortress are still intact, and also still in existence is the subterranean tunnel, almost 3,000 feet long, leading to the heart of the village and coming out in the middle of the church, used in times of trouble to make possible an easy escape when necessary. Today, it is the home of multitudes of bats. When the Dutch had conquered the northernmost tip of Ceylon, they were able to deal in another kind of costly tradable product, namely the elephant. Not only the ivory, but primarily the elephant itself as a living work machine was of the highest value, especially for the Indian market. Under Dutch authority, the wild elephants were caught in huge traps and tamed. Afterwards, they were taken to Jaffna by way of the so-called Elephant Pass, and from there on to India in special ships. In this way, thousands of elephants were traded, bringing in a considerable fortune for the Dutch. The trade in Jaffna was protected by the solid Dutch fortress, built out of the local rock-hard coral stone, therefore still in a perfect state after 3 centuries. Within the compound of this huge fortress is an open space at the end of which the old Dutch Kruiskerk church still stands. Opposite this church used to stand the gallows, to which in turbulent times many a villain knave was strung up. A peculiar stone has been built into the inner wall of the fortress. Originally, this stone was set in the courtyard, some feet away from the gallows, so that every condemned man could read the inscription just before he was hanged. It reads, "God is the supreme judge." Along with a Protestant religion, the Dutch introduced a thorough educational system. In the vicinity of Jaffna alone, 34 schools appeared, with 20,000 pupils who were taught Dutch and Latin in addition to their own language. As a result of this, Jaffna today still has the lowest rate of illiteracy in the whole of Sri Lanka. From the countless little islands in the beautiful lagoon in front of Jaffna, the Dutch chose a particular one as the most strategically situated for the defense of the harbor. Every inch of the tiny island of Hammenhiel was built over with a fortress, which is still in perfect condition and has since reached the status of national monument. Time and again, the 17 gentlemen, the board of the Dutch East India Company, gave vent to their opinion that as far as they were concerned, the first Dutch inhabitants of Ceylon were a felonious and ungodly crowd, concerning themselves more with the alluring native girls than with serious matters. Men who fathered children by native girls were heavily fined if they didn't marry the girl, and were not allowed to return to Holland until both their wife and children had died. Only later on, governors with a bit more sense and insight encouraged mixed marriages, as the offspring from such alliances proved to be much better fitted for the climate, and also because blood is, of course, thicker than water. As soon as the Dutch were in control of the fertile coastal areas of Ceylon, the farmland was mapped and divided into estates. The natives were involved in building houses, and tenants, farmers, and landowners were all subjected to an intricate tax system. Taxes were levied in money, land, labor, but above all, in goods. For the sole purpose of levying these taxes, the Dutch surveyed every inch of land and entered all the information in voluminous registers called tombos. Mr. Paranativana, this is a tombo. Yes, these are some pages from a tombo. The tombos are so big and heavy that I couldn't possibly bring a complete volume. The Portuguese actually started them, but the Dutch vastly elaborated on them.
En door de Nederlanders zo uitgebreid gebruik van gemaakt.
So these tombos are written in the Dutch language. What exactly were they used for? The tombos were used to levy taxes for the company. Here on the left, we find the name of the owner, and here are his possessions. And over here are two columns, one for sowing fields and the other for plots. In this column here, we find the number of trees, and over here, the amount of tax he owed the company. Is this why you speak Dutch so fluently? Yes, about 6 years ago, I was given the opportunity to go to Holland to study archives. First, I learned the language, and after that, I qualified as an archivist. I understand that these ancient tombos are still being used now. Yes, they're still in use, and we're often called upon by the court to give an explanation of what they say. The tombos are mainly used in cases of land dispute that have ended up in court. In any event, jurisdiction in Sri Lanka is still based on the Roman Dutch law. The Sinhalese language, too, is still interlarded with more than 500 Dutch words. And it's a startling experience for a Dutch person who chances upon these card-playing Sinhalese to find them after so many centuries still calling clubs, hearts, spades, and diamonds by their Dutch names. For a whole century, everything had been going smoothly for the Dutch in Ceylon. They made good profits, and the folk inhabiting the coastal areas lived in peace with the foreign occupiers. But by halfway through the 18th century, when the powerful Baron van Eck came on the scene, things were already in a state of fermentation. The Dutch had suffered a humiliating defeat in the highlands of the rebellious Kingdom of Kandy. With great effort, Van Eck put down a revolt in Matara and immediately built a new and solid star fortress there in order to prevent this from happening again. After that, Van Eck started to get a punitive expedition ready against the rebel king. Apart from his own company of soldiers, the expedition consisted of many Sinhalese mercenaries and coolies. In January 1765, Van Eyck set out with his army and several weeks later reached the outposts of Kandy. The king hastily tried to make peace, but Van Eyck first plundered Kandy and then razed it to the ground before he was finally willing to sign a treaty in which the king recognized Dutch sovereignty over all the coastal areas. Van Eyck was killed, however, when on the way home his army was harassed by Sinhalese guerrillas. His body was carried to Colombo and buried there. His grave is in one of Colombo's most important monuments, the big Dutch Volvendal Church, built in 1749. More than a century ago, this church was struck by lightning and was never properly restored. Yet today, they still hold services there. On the Keizerstraat in Colombo, the Dutch built an orphanage, which was recently restored with Dutch aid and converted into a museum of the Dutch period. This Dutch period ended around 1800, when the VOC had become badly weakened and crippled by wars in Europe, and Stadtholder William II had to flee to England, where he was more or less blackmailed into writing a letter stating that all business interests in Ceylon would be handed over to the British. Meanwhile, Ceylon had already become such a liability that the Dutch really couldn't care less when in 1802, at the Treaty of Amiens, Ceylon officially became a British colony. And for the Dutch, the curtain had fallen.